In this tutorial, we'll jump into your introduction to Story Framework's interaction system, making the most out of Story Framework's Interactables, and diving into all of the different editable options within Interactables themselves. So this tutorial will take you through a few examples of Interactables and explain how these different options all work and how some can be, or how some can function in coherence with one another. So let's jump right into it. First of all, let's briefly explain how interaction works inside of Story Framework. So if we open up our content browser, we can go over to the Story Framework folder, Core, let's go to Blueprints, and then to Blueprint Interfaces. We have a SF interaction underscore BPI. So interaction is all driven through Blueprint Interfaces. This just helps the modularity of interaction within Story Framework, which also means this will allow you to quickly iterate over custom interaction methods, which we will jump into. So if we go ahead and hit play, we are in the gameplay animation sample project and Story Framework integrated project. You can see when we walk up to these interactables, we get prompted our interaction prompt, and we can interact with these different items. So this is all driven through a trace. So if we go over to Core, Blueprints, Components, Core again, looking for the interaction manager. If we go ahead and open this up and into the event graph, we have our interaction dependencies. Very quickly running through this. So we have our general camera interaction trace, which is our line trace. And the interaction manager component handles all the rest. So let's go ahead back into our content browser to the Story Framework folder, Core and Blueprints again. We'll notice we have our interactable base blueprint. So anything that can be interacted with in this level all derives from this one blueprint, or this one class. So these are all essentially interactable base blueprint parented. So for instance, the generator, if we go to edit, we can see in the top right it's parented to the interactable base. So this is what we would use to set up our interaction. For custom interaction, we would simply right click on this interactable base and create a child blueprint and edit it from there, which we will get into a little later. Another thing I want to touch on is in this tutorial, we're going to primarily be using the SF Tools Editor Utility widget. So this Editor Utility widget just essentially breaks down all the different editable options for interactables and inserts them into their respective categories. So by default, we have this monitor here, which is an interactable. We have all the interaction data under one structure, and this can be quite overwhelming at times. So the Editor Utilities interactable section aims to sort of break this down in a more digestible fashion. So let's go ahead and start setting up an example. Our first example will be a pickup. So we can just drag an interactable base blueprint into the level. Now with our editor utilities open, again this can be found in Story Framework Utility, and we'll find the SF Tools Editor Utility widget. We can right click and choose Run Editor Utility widget. So now with our interactable selected, we'll get prompted all these different options. We have the object basic info. So here we can give our object a name that will be displayed on the prompt. We're going to call this a old photo, and we're going to give it the example photo mesh that comes included with Story Framework. So now that we have this information inserted here, we can hit apply changes, and this will update now on the interactable. Very simple. So now we can go back. Let's go into interaction settings. So this is where we would define our interaction methods. So we have a primary interaction method and a secondary interaction method. And then we also have a interaction collision radius. So if we bump this up to something like 25 and hit apply changes, we'll see now we have a radius that will block the player's interaction trace. So this just makes it a little bit easier to interact with this item, especially if it's something smaller and we're using a controller. It can be quite tricky to look directly at a smaller item. So let's change our primary interaction method to quick pickup. So we have inspect, quick pickup, drag object, and player has item. We'll do quick pickup for this example. And then the secondary interaction method, we can choose between none and inspect. For this simple example, we're just going to leave it as none. We can hit apply changes and go back. Actually, we can go back into our interaction settings and we can edit the options for this interaction method by clicking on this little modify interaction method icon. So this will take us to the options for this interaction method. So we can define a icon. I don't believe Story Framework has an icon for the photo mesh, so we'll just use a cassette icon for this example. And here we can define if this item can be combined with other items, if this item can be quote-unquote used, or if this item can be dropped. So we'll set can combine to true and hit apply changes and go back again, back once more. Next up we have the prompt settings. So here we can choose a custom prompt. If we leave this empty, if we leave this field empty, there are a few predefined prompt texts depending on the interaction method you choose. So for example, with the quick pickup interaction method, the prompt text will automatically default to pickup. We can also define the distance at which the prompts start to fade in. So this would be dependent on the scale of your object. Obviously, if it's something bigger, we'd want the prompts to scale or to fade in earlier, or rather we would want the prompts to fade in at a further distance. So this is the distance in unreal units from this object to the player. So we can set this to something a little larger. We'll set it to 600 just so it's apparent. And then we have the relative prompt offset. So we have this little scene icon on our interactable that indicates where the prompt will be. So if we give it a small update of 25 on the Z and hit apply changes, and we slightly move this actor to update the construction script, we'll see the prompt offsets icon changes. So this is to visually indicate where this will be when the player is looking at this object. So we'll just set this back to 0 for now and update the construction script again. So that covers the prompt settings. So we'll give it a custom prompt text to demonstrate. So we'll just call this take picture. Let's go back again. We have the item inventory settings. So this is the same for the quick pickup settings. And then we have the sound settings. So here we can define different sounds depending on our interaction method. So since we're using quick pickup, we can play a sound on interacted. I believe there is a pickup example sound that we can use. Hit apply changes and back again. So now if we go ahead and hit play and test this out, we can see the little circle indicating this item is interactable is displaying at quite a far distance. This is from the 600 units that we defined. So now we can walk up to this interactable. We can see the name is displaying on the top, old photo, and our prompt text, take picture. If we hit E, we're picking up the item, it's getting added to the player's inventory. We defined can drop and can use. Right now there's no custom logic for using this item. We can drop it on the floor, we can pick it back up. Let's quickly jump onto using items and how this can be set up. So inside Story Framework, let's go to Core, Blueprints, Components, Core again, and we're looking for the Inventory Manager. Let's go to the event graph, and we'll see a graph that has a comment of bind custom use item logic here. So this is where we would create custom logic depending on the item that we're using. So we would, any item that we'd want to use, we just simply add its name that we set up, its object name, into the switch on string. So we named that item old photo. And for this example, we're just going to simply drag off and print string. So now every time we use that item, we should print out the hello string. So if we pick it up and hit use, we can see where, or the hello message is being printed. So this is where we would set up our own custom logic for using items. Story Framework provides the general framework to get that going. Let's jump onto some more interactable examples. So let's copy and paste this interactable that we set up earlier. Let's go to the basic info. Let's actually first look at our interaction methods. We can now demonstrate the inspect method as well. So let's hit apply changes. We've changed the primary interaction method to inspect. The basic info, let's change this to a mug. And we'll call this used mug or empty mug. And apply changes. You can adjust the position of this actor. We'll leave the collision radius the same as the photo. So interaction settings, we have inspect, we can edit this. So here's where we can define our inspect method for our inspect. So we have pan to object, 3D inspect readable, and 3D inspect plus readable. So 3D inspect plus readable is essentially just these two inspect methods combined. So we're going to be using this as a demonstration. We can apply changes. We can define whether this item can be picked up while inspecting. We'll set that to true. The 3D inspect distance from camera. So this is essentially how far away the mesh will be displayed when we inspect it. So since this is a pretty small mesh, we can get away with about 60 units away from the camera. Since the pivot of this static mesh that we're using, this mug, is pretty central in the mesh, we don't need to adjust the object offset. So if your pivot is, say, towards the bottom of your mesh or the top, we can add an offset to try and centralize that pivot, sort of artificially in a sense. So we can hit apply changes. Here's where we can define our readable text color and our readable pages. So let's add a readable page here. We can add the text, so we can call this is an example of page text. We can hit apply changes, and we can leave the readable text color to white. We can change the prompt settings here to look at mug. So if we go up to our mug, we're getting prompted to look at this mug. As you can see, we have our 3D inspect mesh in the center of our screen. And in the bottom left, we have the prompt to read. So this is the text that we set up. And take the item. So we've now taken the item. We haven't changed the inventory options for this item, so it's still displaying the cassette from when we copied over this interactable. So let's quickly touch on the readable pages. We can give it a page or a icon, which is essentially a image background. So there is a page background overlay example image that we can use. And every page that we add is a new page that the player can flip through. So we'll call this page 2. Again, giving it that same icon. And again, page 3. And since this icon is pretty white, or this page background is pretty light and pretty white, we can change the readable text color to be a contrasting color, which would be black. Hit apply changes. So if we go up to this actor again and look at it, and we read it, we now have that background image that we set, and our 3 pages. So this inspect method can be applied as a secondary interaction method as well. So exactly the same settings as we just covered with the mug. If we select our photo, we can just set the secondary interaction method as inspect. Now we haven't set the inspect settings on this one, but just to demonstrate, we'll now get a secondary prompt, which will be prompting the player to look at this item. So I've quickly gone ahead and changed the photo to a cassette, as we're going to demonstrate the has item interaction method. So let's copy and paste our interactable again. Object basic info, let's give it the monitor static mesh. And we'll just call this monitor and apply changes. So this is the actor we'll now use for the has item interaction method. So if we select on our monitor, we go to interaction settings, we can choose the player has item, we can set the secondary to none, hit apply changes and edit this primary interaction method. So here we can define if the player must have all the items, if we should consume the items that the player requires, and we can define the target item names. So we can define the item name, the amount or the amount of the item that the player needs, and an optional icon to display on the prompt. This is not necessary, but It helps with visual feedback, telling the player what items they require. So let's add an example of this. So let's do cassette. The player will just need a single cassette, and we can give it the cassette icon. We can also select must, or we can set must player have all items to true, and hit play. Let's also slightly adjust the prompt offset. Let's do something like 50 and apply changes. It's a bit high. Let's do 30 and apply changes. Let's go ahead and test this. So now our monitor is requiring the cassette icon, or the cassette item, sorry, and the icon is being displayed above the prompt. We can also just quickly change the prompt text to insert cassette and apply changes. So now if we go ahead and take this cassette, you can see we have it in our inventory, and we are now being prompted to insert the cassette. So we set the target item name to cassette. We can see in our inventory the item that we're currently highlighted over is a cassette. So we have that item in our inventory. If we drop it, then we can no longer get prompted to interact with this item. We pick it up again, we get prompted, and we can interact with it. So let's quickly remove the play sound on interacted. Now we're going to jump into setting up custom logic for the has item interaction method. So by default, the has item interaction method handles deciding whether or not to output a specific data string from the interact with event that gets called when you interact with items. So we'll jump into that now. So by default, we would need to create an instance of the interactable base so that we can add custom functionality to this interactable. So we'll go ahead and create a child blueprint. We'll drag this out into the scene, and in the details panel on our interaction data structure, we can just copy this and paste it onto this actor. So we have all those same settings again, just on a child of the interactable base. If we go ahead and open up our child blueprint, we can go over into the bottom left and implement the event interact with BPI function. So if we drag off of this quickly and hit or search for a print string, compile and save, we can see the strings that we're getting outputted. So not found. If we pick up the item, we're getting found. So we can use this data string to execute different functionality depending on whether or not the player has the target item or items. So for this example, this would get handled using a switch on string. We would add 2 pins, found and not found. So these are our 2 execution pins depending on the logic we want to execute. So we want to execute or found when the player has the item and we interact with the mesh. So for this example, we're going to drag off, we're going to search for a play sound 2D. Again, this is where you would handle your own logic. This is just an example. And we will play the light switch cue, just as an example. So if we click on this actor, we're not hearing any sounds playing because it's executing the not found on the switch on string. If we take this item and use it, we're now getting that sound played every time we interact with this actor. So if we go ahead and look at the has item interaction settings again, we had consume target item off. If we set it to true and hit play, if we pick up this item and interact, it's going to remove it from the player's inventory. Finally, we're going to quickly touch on the drag object interaction method. So this is a newer interaction method that was introduced in Story Framework 4. So this is used for this little drawer example that I have set up. So if we just copy this over and paste this over here. We can quickly touch on how this works. So when we have the drawer interaction method set up, we'll have these little indicators explaining or visually explaining how far out the object will move. So if we go into the interaction settings, the drag object, we can define whether or not this actor should rotate. For this example, for drawers, we are not needing it to rotate, we just want it to move. We are affecting the x-axis, and then here we can define the drag min-max distance from origin. So if we up this to something like 60 and hit apply changes and update the construction script, we can see this little icon changes the location of where it is. And then we can define the focus camera mode. So the focus camera mode specifies how the player will look at this item while they're dragging it. So if we set it to none, then the player's camera will simply just stay in place while the actor moves back and forth. Focus on interact point will focus on the point at where the player interacts with this object, and it will move accordingly. And focus on origin will simply just focus on the origin of this actor. So for this example, we'll use focus on interact points. If we hit play, we can see now if we interact and hold the interact key, we can move this object. If we change the affected axis to say +1 on the Z and hit apply changes, we can now see this object will move up and down instead of forward and backwards. So in this little example area in the example map, we're using that same drag interaction method to turn a valve. So you can see we are turning the valve. So this is using the rotate. So we have rotate set to true, and we have the affected axis set to 1 on the X. And we have the drag min max distance for the rotate set to -270 and +270. These high values just basically allow this actor to fully rotate in a circle without being restricted. And then here we have focus on interact point. So we can change this to focus on origin to demonstrate that. So now when we interact with this, our player will look at the origin of the valve and we can turn it. So if we quickly do this puzzle that I have set up, it will unlock this door, and this door as well also uses the rotate drag method. So we can hold on this door and rotate it open and closed. So again, the editor utility widget from Story Framework will help streamline creating and setting up interactables. It is a relatively new tool that was introduced in Story Framework 4. So if for any reason values that are set here aren't updating correctly, then again, all of these values are changed in the details panel of the actor under the interaction data structure. So for instance, all of the different interaction methods are under their respective categories. So we have the has item, inspect, drag, pickup, and the general interaction methods. So this can all be changed here if needed. So to touch on setting up custom logic when we interact with an object, we briefly touched on this with the has item. So what we'll do is just quickly demonstrate how this can apply to any interaction method. So we'll use the default interaction method. So this simply just calls the interact with BPI function and nothing else. So this is good for setting up your own logic, the default interaction method. So we can edit this class again. So now whenever we interact, we can just drag off and use a print string, for example. Whenever we interact with this object, it will print that string out. So this is where we would set up our custom logic for our interactables. We can use the default interaction method, like I mentioned, to just call this interact with event and not do anything else. Some other useful things. A lot of the functions used for the different interaction methods, such as the pickup item, is just simply a function called from the SF inventory manager. So we can get a reference and drag this off and search for add item to inventory. So if we plug this in to our event interact with, get a function, or right click and get the get interaction data from this interactable. And we can set the pending kill to self. So if we leave this pin empty, it won't destroy any actor. If we set a reference to something like this actor itself, then it will destroy itself. So we can test this out. We can go ahead and pick this up. It's going to add it to our inventory. So this is essentially the same as the pickup method. So we can use these functions to create our own interaction essentially. Some other neat things you can do with Interactables, there are a few tags that the interaction system reads and can change the behavior of Interactables. So for instance, if we give this actor the tag soft locked, this will now stop interaction with this actor. We can't interact with this anymore until that tag is removed. So we can demonstrate this in the level blueprint. So let's just add a small delay of 2 seconds. Let's get a reference to that interactable, and then we can get tags, and we can do a clear. So this would be removing any tags that that actor has. So if we hit play, we can't interact with this. After 2 seconds, we can interact with it again. So this is good to sort of paste certain interactables. If you don't want the player to pick it up at a specific time in gameplay, maybe rather they should come back after they've done a certain task, then they can pick it up. You can utilize the soft log tag in that sense. Then we also have the ignore outlines. This just simply doesn't outline the actor when it's hovered over. So let's go ahead and remove the soft log tag and disconnect the setup in the level blueprint. So now we don't have an outline around our actor anymore, as we have that ignore outlines. And the next one we can use is ignore prompt trace. So this just basically allows the interaction prompt to display through geometry. So we can see it's displaying through this little desk that we have set up here. If you need an interactable to display through something that's transparent, maybe this would be useful. So by default, if we don't have this trace, if there's something occluding the vision or the trace from the player to the object, then the icon will be hidden. So we can utilize these different tags to manipulate interactables in specific ways. But that should just about cover your introduction to interactables within Story Framework. If you have any questions about setting up your own interaction that you're curious about and not sure how to go about doing so, please do feel free to message me or anyone else in our Discord community, and we'll be more than happy to help where we can. Enjoy the rest of your day. Peace.